The ancient records make frequent references to the construction of temples, incorporating places to store the gods' craft. Why would the ancient peoples bother to construct parking places for spaceships for an unseen mythical vessel? These details leave us with many unanswered questions. So let's speculate. I love speculating. Welcome to the 29th episode of the Quintology Files. We're going to pick up from where we left off in the last episode with a slightly different focus. The Abrahamic faiths denigrate pagan gods, but many of the descriptions and demands made by Yahweh are surprisingly similar to those made by pagan gods in his locality. As we discussed in the previous episode, evidence points to at least some of these gods being more than just imaginary. But if they were living beings, what were they? Were they elite humans? Did they come from elsewhere? There's a mass of often mundane records which point to them being real living creatures. They not only procreated, but they had individual preferences for different foods, prepared detailed cooking recipes, specified a range of spices, and many references pointing to mechanical means of transport. It seems to me that both conventional history and Christian beliefs concerning the gods that were worshipped by ancient Middle Eastern cultures have been formed primarily by the early, widespread availability of English Bible translations circulated and absorbed at a time before we could translate and understand Egyptian hieroglyphics and cuneiform texts. This has led to the complete adoption of biblical interpretations, namely that all the peoples that lived around the Israelites mindlessly worshipped pagan gods that were mere inert idols made of wood or stone. Gradually, we've come to realize this is a totally false representation. Let's enumerate some reasons for that claim. Firstly, and quite obviously, no one believed that a wooden statue of, say, Osiris was actually Osiris, any more than anyone alive today believes a statue of Jesus in a Catholic church is actually Jesus. Both are representations and both serve exactly the same purpose. Secondly, the massive detail in the biblical accounts of Jesus' life strongly point to him being a real person, living a human life. Actually, the same applies when we read the writings of the major gods of the ancient Middle East cultures. Thirdly, if we explain the miracles performed by Jesus, multiplying bread, restoring sight to the blind, as proving his divinity, how do we explain these detailed inscriptions of Horus performing exactly the same miracles thousands of years earlier? Fourthly, do the miracles Jesus reportedly performed point to advanced medical knowledge? Do the frequent references to aerial transport used by the ancient gods point to advanced transport technology? Fifthly, the descriptions of the abodes of the ancient gods don't fit archaeologists' descriptions of these being purely temples, but point to palaces with astronomical observatories, plus space for civil administration and justice. And finally, the elaborate requirements for food and drink offerings required by Yahweh, which are tediously set out in Leviticus and Numbers, bear an uncanny resemblance to those of the Babylonian gods, as do the ridiculous requirements for Yahweh's priests to sprinkle animal blood on the right foot, the left thumb, and over the right shoulder. This is one of many pointers which again point the dating of the writing of the Torah to the period of the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BC, not by Moses, in the 16th century BC, as claimed by many theologians. For me, it's pretty obvious that Yahweh was just another one of what became termed the pagan gods. And there's evidence as to which one he was. Initially, the Sumerian god Nanna, known in Akkadian as Sign, and later it's possible Yahweh became modelled on Shamash, which actually would be very ironic, because as we discussed in a previous episode, Shamash was later assimilated into the Christian god. In the merger negotiations Emperor Constantine supervised between his religion, Sol Invictus, which was the later embodiment of Shamash, and the Christians themselves at the Council of Nicaea in 325.
That's quite an extraordinary set of claims. Let's try and unpack what you said.
Firstly, let's look at some records which point to those ancient gods being living beings, human or otherwise. Last week we talked about Ra, aka Marduk, and his seeming presence and then lack of appearances, with his absence generating the title Amen. We have various accounts of Marduk counselling Cyrus and leading the Persian forces. We have previously talked about the Sumerian princess who around 2300 BC developed a very detailed catalogue of all the gods' abodes across the Sumerian Empire, listing the facilities in each palace and their different dietary requirements and daily food deliveries, etc.
So if these gods enjoyed food and drink, did they age and die?
Interestingly, we do find many references to this, to gods who are reported as growing old and infirm. For example, Ninhursag, who is a sister to both Enlil, the Lord Most High, and Enki, who became affectionately known as the Old Cow. In Egyptian, she was given the title Hathor. There are also reports of the aging of Ra, the aging of Osiris, of Thoth, and of Harpy. We also find references to a number of gods actually dying, including Osiris, Anubis, Harpy, Dumatef, Imseti, Quebecasenef, and Seka. Then we find gods being buried in a special cemetery, the burial ground of Henenusset, now known by its Greek name Heraclepolis, which is near Memphis, which was reserved for gods and maintained by a priesthood. So these gods seem much more human than divine. They may have had powers, authority, knowledge, some technology, but they consumed food and drink, they got old, they were killed or they died, and they were buried. So in the same way that leaders and sports stars and pop stars get worshipped today, from what one can see in records, I think our archaeologists have misled us by misclassifying these leaders as being fake gods.
If there was a number of gods, did they compete with each other about territory and or people?
Well, originally, when the Middle Eastern cultures emerged, there seems to have been a widespread idea that each god controlled their own defined territory. This understanding comes from both Jewish scripture and from the records of other ancient cultures. But with the passage of millennia, the link to territory weakened, whilst Sign and Marduk seemed to compete for the jewel of Babylon, as we referred to in the previous episode, from around 1000 BC onwards, religious observance in Greek and Roman culture was much more open. The gods who had accumulated many stories of great achievements gained a sort of international following, none more so than the Theban Trinity, Osiris, Isis, and their son Horus. Isis being the most popular divinity across the entire Roman Empire at the time of Jesus. The Torah has many references to there being 70 sons, I personally think descendants of the Lord Almighty, of which Yahweh stands out as being a bit outspoken. But each was associated with having a defined territory. If we look at 1 Samuel 10 verse 1, it states that Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it on Saul's head, and kissed him, saying, "Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance?" This echoes Deuteronomy 32:9. The Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. Meaning that Yahweh, being one of the 70 sons, descendants of the Lord Almighty, El Elyon, was allotted the Israelites as his personal inheritance. Accordingly, the other 69 gods, probably just as real as Yahweh, each inheriting different geographical territories. The overall impression we have is that originally the gods were regarded as very territorial. When people migrated or moved into new territory, they then adopted the local god as the power to whom they should show obedience. And there are many examples of this throughout the Old Testament, where to some extent it would be the place you wouldn't expect to find it. If we look in 1 Samuel 26:19, provides fascinating evidence of Yahweh being just one of many gods and being seen as ruling only within his own territory, even by his own prophets. In this verse, David is asking Saul why he's trying to hunt him down. Is it because Yahweh has told Saul to do this, or is it on the advice of men? If it's on the advice of men, then these should be cursed by Yahweh, because they have driven David outside the lands forming the inheritance of the Lord, thereby saying to him, "Go serve other gods." This seems to confirm that Yahweh's inheritance was the promised land, and outside that territory, lands belong to other gods, who would have to be served if you lived there. 1 Samuel 27:7 states David lived for a year and 4 months in Philistine territory. But it's silent as to which god David felt he had to worship whilst he was there. I wonder if it was Dagon. We may never find out. The Amorites moved to Samaria, or what became Samaria, by Ashurbanipal after he transported the Israelite tribes to Nineveh, appealed for one of Yahweh's priests to teach them the rituals expected of Yahweh's people. And we mentioned that in the last episode. Extensive archaeological evidence shows that Israelites themselves adopted the worship of Baal, whom actually I conclude is probably the same god as Sin and Yahweh, just different local names. But also they adopted worship of Ashtoreth, who is recorded in Canaan as being Baal's consort. And Ashtoreth is represented in biblical records as being Yahweh's consort and was worshipped by Israelites for many centuries. Hundreds of miniatures have been excavated by Israeli archaeologists showing an entwined Yahweh and his Ashtoreth. Yahweh's management of the interchange between the Israelites and the Philistines defies logical explanation. Having wisely chosen the crown prince, Abraham, ahead of the Sumerian culture succumbing to a disaster which destroyed most of their cities in southern Iraq, Yahweh persisted with these troublesome Israelites for a millennium until Abraham's descendant, David, finally got close to reoccupying the promised land that he was supposed to do 1,000 years earlier. Shows a lot of patience. But soon afterwards, Yahweh seems to give up on his chosen people, allowing Ashurbanipal and then Nebuchadnezzar to gobble them up almost completely. We go back slightly. During the recovery of the Promised Land under the judges between 1200 BC and 1000 BC, Yahweh was presented with the chance to adopt a successful, warlike people whose cousins would go on to flower as the dominant power, spreading a powerful civilizing culture right across the known world. I refer, of course, to the Greeks, the Greek tribes that settled what is now Gaza and then became known as the Philistines. Despite claiming to be all-powerful, Yahweh passed up the chance to forge a strong alliance between these two peoples, effectively the Greeks and the Israelites. Such a union could have resisted the Assyrians and later easily resisted the Chaldeans. If we look back, it's interesting to note the first voluntary union of two cultures was actually the Akkadians and the Sumerians that lived together peaceably for millennia. And one wonders whether we'll find records which indicate an involvement by the Lord Almighty, El Elyon, in that peaceful union. We've barely translated, I think, 5% of the tablets from Sumeria, so it'd be interesting what may emerge over the following years.
Do Jewish festivals point to a unique God, or are there similarities to pagan festivals?
Actually, many Jewish religious festivals point to a theology closely shared with pagan gods. I'll give you 3 examples. The Sabbath, derived from the Sumerian Shabbatu, was originally a Sumerian monthly day of rest. Obviously, this would be celebrated by Abraham's family. But by the era of the Babylonian exile, quite a few cultures later, this had become a weekly festival. Funny, really, how in the Pentateuch, supposedly written during the Exodus, 1,000 years before the exile, at least, it reflects the exilic period of weekly occurrence rather than the Sumerian monthly Shabbatu. Secondly, the Feast of the Tabernacles, celebrating the grape harvest in honor of Dionysus, originally a Sumerian god, later known to the Romans as Bacchus. The close resemblance to tabernacles and the Feast of Thyrospheria, in honor of Bacchus, Dionysus, was noted by Plutarch, who lived AD 45 to 120. He described the common features of both festivals. Booths made of palm branches and ivy, the playing of cithens, like a sort of harp, and the mitre, tunic, and bells on the vestments of the high priests, and the timing in late September to coincide with the first vintage. Thirdly, the celebration of the new moon, which was continued by the Israelites, had started in adoration of the god Sin, the city god of the ancient cities of both Ur and Haran, again pointing to the possibility of Yahweh and Sin being one and the same. Moreover, important elements of the story in the Torah can be traced to older belief systems. Some believe the 10 Commandments originated from ancient Egyptian beliefs, adopted by the Israelites during their sojourn in Egypt. Chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, also known as the Papyrus of Anu, where we have copies dating back to almost pre-dynastic, so 3000 BC, include a list of statements that a man must swear to before he is allowed to enter heaven. These sworn statements bear a remarkable resemblance to the Ten Commandments in their nature and even in their phrasing. Statements include, I have not defiled the wife of a man. I have not committed murder. I have not committed theft. I have not lied. I have not cursed God. I have not borne false witness. I have not abandoned my parents. And what I have just said is obviously a translation from hieroglyphs into English. And if I quoted the Ten Commandments, I'd be doing that from probably ancient Hebrew, revised by the Mezorites, and then into English. So the similarity of the originals must be much closer. There are also many links to solar worship. Many have drawn attention to Psalm 104, which seems to be two songs joined together. The first, verses 1 to 18, is almost a carbon copy of Akhenaten's Hymn to the Sun. The latter part of 104 is very close to the worship song to the Canaanite storm god. And if anyone wants to check this, Paul Dion wrote an interesting tract on this, Yahweh as storm and sun god. References to Moses' face as shining after he met Yahweh use the Hebrew word qaran, which means to shine, to send out rays, and to display or grow horns. Hence, old Christian depictions of Moses with horns, e.g. by Michelangelo. Michelangelo painted Moses with horns. The horns have multiple meanings, serving to indicate Moses was the son of the cow. And if we look at the genealogy, his great-grandmother's name was Leah, which means cow. And also, again, you've got a potential link to the golden calf. There's a lot of interesting linkages. Surprisingly, a number of the most ancient synagogues that have been found in Israel contain an image of the sun god, surrounded by the 12 signs of the zodiac. Difficult to believe, I know. But if you want to check any of these, I think 7 have been found at Hamath Taberes, Sepphoris, Beth Alpha, Naran, Sazaya, Uzfaya, and Ein Gedi. Philo, a Jewish historian based in Egypt, in Alexandria in the 1st century BC, and Josephus, a Jewish historian and a contemporary of Jesus, and author of the only surviving contemporary account of Jesus outside the Gospels, both wrote that the 12 tribes of Israel were based upon the zodiac. Quite interesting. If you look at the detailed instructions for ritual cleansing and sacrifices written in Leviticus, these seem to echo instructions found on Babylonian clay tablets, followed by the pagan priests. 4 tablets, referenced Anet 331 through 334, describe the order of events for the New Year festival in the month of Nisan. Interestingly, in the Jewish calendar today, Nisan is still a recognized name of a month. The sequence of the different sacrifices, the prayer recitals, the ritual washing and purification, the decapitation of animals, incantations, animal waste being taken outside the city to open country, where those bearing it must stay for 7 days. The priest's assistant had to take the blood of a sacrificial ram and smear it on the portal and lintels of the palace gateway. Given Leviticus is believed to have been written entirely during the Babylonian exile, the source of inspiration for the contents of Leviticus seems pretty clear. The extremely tedious rituals for different types of sacrifices set out in Leviticus are clearly inspired by the ritual animal sacrifices the Jewish priests would have witnessed being performed for pagan gods, particularly the ritual sprinkling of blood 7 times on the altar, the daubing of blood on the earlobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot, according to Leviticus 8:23. After reading Leviticus, it's hardly credible to claim that Yahweh is the God that designed our universe. Rituals prescribed for Yahweh are almost indistinguishable from rituals for gods such as Sin and Baal.
Do ancient descriptions of godly transport sound similar to modern tales of UFOs?
Yeah, I think they do. There's amazing similarities. In Egypt, Ra had his celestial boat to travel the skies and the underworld, whilst in Babylon, as Marduk, he had a special parking place for his supreme traveller. In the Lamentation texts, this is at the destruction of Sumer, Enlil returns to the city of Nippur, flying from horizon to horizon, while Sin commanded his boat of heaven, and Ninurta's most prized possession was the Imdugug, known as the divine blackbird. The Bible records Yahweh as descending upon Mount Sinai in a kabod. This is Exodus 24:16, which is usually translated as glory, but its older meaning in Hebrew is heavy, suggestive maybe of an interplanetary transport, surrounded by clouds of smoke. Often, Yahweh travels on a pillar of fire, e.g. Exodus 13:21. Maybe he was using a personal jetpack, whilst Elijah is recorded in 2 Kings 2:11 as being met by a chariot of fire and ascending to heaven in a whirlwind. It all sounds like rocketry to me. The numerous references to gods using aerial craft to travel across the sky are intriguing. At a superficial level, one can see the linkage between gods being associated with stars or planets and therefore credited with the means of travel back and forth. But as well as travelling in these craft, the ancient records make frequent references to the construction of temples, incorporating places to store the gods' craft. Why would the ancient peoples bother to construct parking places for spaceships for an unseen mythical vessel? It suggests there's something more to it. If we look in the Bible, we see King David longed to build a temple for Yahweh, but he was told that it had to wait, and Solomon built it. And Solomon wanted to build a place for the name of the Lord. That seems rather strange, but the word used in Hebrew is Shem. And this puzzled translators, and eventually it got translated as name, creating a rather strange formula of building a temple not for the Lord, but for the name of the Lord. Recently, it was realized that Shem is a loanword from Abraham's native tongue, Sumerian. In Sumerian, Shem means vessel, with references that imply that a vessel could travel across water, underwater, and through the air. Clearly, the best way to get your God to stay in your city and therefore protect it was to build a storage facility for his Shem. Then he would stay there. These details leave us with many unanswered questions. So let's speculate. I love speculating. Were these leaders, these elite humans or whatever, were they survivors not just of the Younger Dryas devastations, but from a space mission that went wrong? Was their spacecraft irreparably damaged, stranding them on Earth. Certainly, if few in number, they'd lack the resources to recreate much in the way of sophisticated technology. The development of metallurgy has been traced to the same post-flood period, initially focusing on softer metals that require lower temperatures like gold, silver, copper, and then bronze. Iron was only first smelted around 3,000 years ago. Certainly, there'd be no hope of manufacturing lightweight composites using aluminium, titanium, etc., nor of producing silicon chips or high-performance optics. On the other hand, given the numerous references to the gods utilizing aerial transport, they must have enjoyed some highly robust and reliable technology, because it seemed to remain functional for many millennia. Tools for precision engineering, cutting and fabricating may initially also have been available, memorialized by the challenging artifacts found in Egypt in particular, and various puzzling megalithic structures found in various places. Maybe the visitors' main craft was equipped for planetary exploration with good stocks of spare parts and portable hand tools. And if they came from elsewhere, what happened to these visitors? Were they ever rescued? Did they depart Earth of their own accord? Or did they just eventually die out from old age? I have found the research compelling, and whilst many questions remain unanswerable, we do have solid reason to reassess the conventional views put forward, both about the pagan gods of the ancient civilizations and about the veracity and accuracy of the text of the Old Testament. I hope you found this episode interesting. If so, please leave a comment. Please press like. Thank you.